The pen was already in my hand when I realized something was wrong. The doctor's office was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel important. The soft hum of the air conditioner, the shuffle of papers, the click of a computer mouse behind the desk. My son stood beside me, close enough that I could feel his presence without looking at him. "Just sign here, Mom," he said, tapping the page lightly with his finger. "It's routine." The paper was already filled out. My name was typed neatly at the top, my address, my date of birth. Everything looked prepared, as if the decision had already been made and my signature was just a formality. I glanced up at the doctor. He smiled politely, the way professionals do when they're trying to keep things moving. "We're a bit short on time today," he said. "This will help us help you." Help me. I looked back down at the page. The words blurred together for a moment, not because I couldn't read them, but because I wasn't sure I was supposed to. My son leaned in slightly. "It's standard," he said again, a little firmer this time. "Everyone signs this." I had come in for what he called a routine appointment. He insisted on driving, said it would be easier if he handled everything. I hadn't argued. Lately, he'd been doing more of the talking for me, booking appointments, speaking to people on my behalf, finishing my sentences when I paused. At first, it felt like care. Now, standing there with that pen in my hand, it felt like something else. The nurse entered the room quietly and stopped when she saw the paper in front of me. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked from the document to my face, then to my son. Her eyes lingered a second too long. "Did you already explain this part?" she asked the doctor. The room shifted. My son answered before the doctor could. "Yes," he said quickly. "She understands." I hadn't said a word. The nurse smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I just want to be sure. These forms can be confusing." "They're not," my son said. "We've been over it." I looked at him then, really looked at him. He wasn't angry, he wasn't nervous, he looked impatient, as if the only thing standing between him and the next step was my hesitation. "Mom," he said softly, lowering his voice, "you trust me, don't you?" That question landed heavier than anything else in the room. I looked back at the document. A paragraph near the middle caught my attention, not because I understood it fully, but because of one phrase that stood out clearly enough. "In the event of incapacity." I frowned. "What does this part mean?" The doctor cleared his throat. "It just allows someone to help manage things if needed." "Someone?" I asked. My son placed his hand lightly on the back of my chair. He said, "Me. It just makes things easier." "Easier for who?" The nurse shifted her weight. "We usually go over that section a bit more slowly," she said carefully. "There's no need. We're already behind." Behind? The pen felt heavier in my hand now. I wasn't afraid, not exactly. I just felt rushed, like the room was moving forward without waiting for me to catch up. "Mom," my son said again, his voice tightening just enough for me to notice. "Please, we don't have all day." I looked at the line where my signature was supposed to go, and for the first time, a clear thought cut through the noise. If I sign this without understanding it, whatever happens next will be legal. The nurse met my eyes. "Would you like a moment?" she asked quietly. My son's hand tightened on the chair. I set the pen down. "Yes," I said, "I would." The room went very still. If I had signed that paper, my life would have legally changed that morning, and I would not have been able to undo it. I didn't always let my son handle things for me. For most of my life, I was the one people leaned on. I managed my household, my finances, my responsibilities, quietly, without asking for help. Even after my husband passed, I learned to navigate paperwork, appointments, and decisions on my own. It wasn't always easy, but it was familiar. What changed wasn't my ability. It was the way my son started framing his concern. It began subtly. He'd call after work and ask how my day had gone. Not in the rushed way people sometimes do out of obligation, but patiently, waiting for my answer. He started reminding me about things, appointments, renewals, errands, not because I forgot them, but because he said he worried I might. "You've been under a lot of stress," he told me once. "I just want to make sure you're not carrying everything alone." At first, I appreciated it. When I mentioned feeling tired more often, he suggested I slow down. When I misplaced my reading glasses one afternoon, he laughed gently and said, "See, this is why it helps to have someone looking out for you." It didn't feel insulting, it felt caring. Then came the offers to help. "I can schedule that appointment for you," he said one evening. "I'll handle the paperwork, it's confusing anyway. Let me talk to them, it'll be faster if I explain." Each time I had the option to say no, and each time it seemed unnecessary to refuse. He never raised his voice, never demanded control. He framed everything as support, as protection, as something any good son would do for his mother. And slowly, without realizing it, I began stepping back. Not because I couldn't manage, but because it felt easier not to argue. The truth is, there's a fine line between help and replacement. I didn't notice when we crossed it. He started attending appointments with me, sitting closer to the desk than I did. When professionals asked questions, he'd answer first, confidently, as if he knew my body better than I did. If I hesitated, he'd finish my thought. "She's been forgetting things lately," he told a pharmacist once, casually. "Nothing serious, but we're keeping an eye on it." I corrected him, lightly. "I wouldn't say forgetting." He smiled. "You don't always notice when it happens." That was the first time I felt something tighten in my chest. But I let it go, because I trusted him, because he was my son, because the alternative, that he might be shaping a version of me that suited his needs, felt unthinkable. His wife watched all of this quietly. She didn't interfere, she didn't contradict him, she observed. When I spoke, she listened politely. When he spoke, she nodded. Sometimes she'd say things like, "He worries about you so much," or "You're lucky to have someone who cares this deeply." Lucky. When the doctor's appointment came up, it was presented as another act of care. "You've been tired," my son said. "You mentioned feeling foggy sometimes. It wouldn't hurt to get checked." "I feel fine," I replied. "I know, this is just preventative, peace of mind." Peace of mind. He offered to drive, said parking was difficult, said he'd already taken time off work. There was no pressure in his voice, just expectation. By then, I was used to letting him take the lead. What I didn't realize was how carefully he'd been building the narrative. To him, I wasn't a woman making choices. I was a woman approaching limitation. And once someone decides that for you, everything you do can be interpreted as evidence. A pause becomes hesitation. A question becomes confusion. A boundary becomes resistance. Sitting in that doctor's office later, with the pen in my hand, I understood something with painful clarity. Trust isn't taken all at once. It's collected gradually in moments that feel reasonable at the time. I hadn't handed my son control. I had allowed him proximity to it. And proximity, given enough time, can look exactly like permission. When the nurse asked if I wanted a moment, it wasn't just about the paper in front of me. It was about every moment before that, every time I'd stayed quiet because it felt easier, kinder, more loving. I didn't distrust my son because he was cruel. I trusted him because he was careful, and that was what made what came next so dangerous. Doctors' offices have a way of lowering your guard without asking permission. The walls are painted in soft, neutral colors. The lights are bright enough to feel clean, but not harsh. Diplomas are framed neatly, arranged at eye level, as if to remind you, subtly, that the people in this room know what they're doing. You're meant to feel safe there. I followed my son down the hallway, my footsteps slower than his. He walked with purpose, nodding at a nurse who passed us, already acting like someone who belonged there. I noticed how naturally he took the lead, opening doors, speaking first, answering questions before I had the chance.
At the reception desk, he handed over my identification before I even reached into my purse. "She's here for her appointment," he said. "I'll be staying with her." The receptionist smiled at him and typed quickly. I stood beside him, suddenly feeling more like a visitor than the patient. We were guided into an exam room. I sat on the edge of the chair instead of the examination table, my hands folded in my lap. The paper covering the table crinkled softly when I shifted. A laminated poster showing the human brain hung on the wall, arrows pointing to parts with names I couldn't pronounce. Everything about the room felt official. The doctor entered a moment later, greeting my son first. "Good morning," he said, extending his hand to him. "Thanks for bringing her in." Bringing her in? I smiled politely. "Good morning." The doctor nodded, but his attention returned to my son almost immediately. They spoke briefly about scheduling, about test results that hadn't been discussed yet. I listened, aware that the conversation was moving quickly, smoothly, like a process already in motion. A clipboard was handed over. "These are standard intake and authorization forms," the doctor said. "Most of it has already been filled out based on the information we received." I looked down. My name was typed neatly at the top. So was my address, my date of birth, answers to questions I didn't remember being asked, memory concerns, assistance with daily decisions, family support present. I frowned. I don't recall saying this. My son leaned in slightly. "It's just how they phrase things," he said calmly. "You know how forms are." The doctor nodded. "It doesn't mean anything on its own," he said. "It's simply documentation." On its own. That phrase caught my attention. The doctor continued explaining how common it was for families to plan ahead, how paperwork helped avoid confusion later, how nothing about these forms meant I couldn't make my own decisions. Yet the language he used kept circling the same idea: if needed, just in case, to make things easier. The nurse entered quietly while he spoke, setting down a tray. Her eyes moved from the clipboard to my face, then to my son. "Have you had a chance to review everything?" she asked me. "I'm reading it now," I replied. My son smiled. "She likes to take her time." The nurse nodded, but her gaze returned to the document. "She usually explains this section verbally," she said, pointing toward the middle of the page, "just to be sure everyone understands." "There's really no need," my son said quickly. "We've already talked about it." The nurse hesitated, not long enough to cause a scene, but long enough for me to notice. The doctor glanced at the clock on the wall. "We are running a bit behind today." Behind. That word changed the atmosphere. The room went from conversational to procedural, from discussion to expectation. The forms were placed squarely in front of me, the pen resting on top, positioned so precisely it felt deliberate. "This just allows us to coordinate care if anything changes. It's standard." "Coordinate with whom?" I asked softly. "What exactly does this authorize?" The doctor paused, just a fraction of a second. "It allows us to work with your son if there are concerns. It's nothing unusual." My son placed his hand lightly on the back of my chair. "It just means I can help, that's all." Help. The word sounded different now than it had weeks earlier. As I held the clipboard, I became aware of something else, the quiet way the process was moving forward without truly waiting for me. No one was forcing my hand. No one raised their voice. They didn't have to. The environment itself was doing the work. Everything about the room said, "This is normal, this is safe, this is routine." But something in my chest tightened. I hadn't come here to give anything away, and yet I was one signature away from doing exactly that. The moment the forms were placed in front of me, the tone in the room shifted. Nothing dramatic happened, no raised voices, no sudden movements, but the patience that had filled the space only minutes earlier quietly disappeared, replaced by something more rigid. The doctor glanced at the clock again.
We are a little behind today, he said, so if we could wrap this up. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. My son picked up the pen and placed it gently in my hand, guiding my fingers around it as if the decision had already been made. Just sign at the bottom, Mom, he said softly. Then we can go. Go where? That word unsettled me more than it should have. The signature line sat there, clean and final looking, my name typed neatly beneath it. Everything about the page suggested completion, like the last step in a process I hadn't realized I was part of. I still don't fully understand this section, I said, tapping the page lightly with the pen. The part about decision making. My son exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but unmistakably frustrated. We've talked about this, he said. It's just in case. It doesn't change anything right now. The doctor nodded in agreement. It simply allows coordination if there are concerns later. It's preventative. Preventative. The word was meant to reassure. Instead, it made my stomach tighten. I noticed how no one asked me if I wanted this. They explained why it was useful, why it was efficient, why it would make things easier, but the choice itself was already being assumed. The nurse stood near the counter, her hands folded loosely in front of her. She hadn't spoken again, but she hadn't left either. We really do need to move forward, the doctor said. There are other patients waiting. Time pressure. It's remarkable how effective it can be. My son leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear him. You're overthinking this, he said. You always do this when you're anxious. Anxious. I wasn't anxious. I was alert. But the word reframed my hesitation as a flaw, something emotional rather than rational. I looked up at him. His expression wasn't angry. It was focused, determined, like someone watching the final seconds of a clock. Across the room, his wife sat quietly, her posture composed, her attention fixed on me. She didn't rush me, she didn't interrupt. Her silence carried its own kind of pressure. If you're not comfortable, we can revisit this later, the doctor said, though his tone suggested that later would be inconvenient. It really is in your best interest. My best interest. That phrase has a way of ending discussions. I held the pen above the page, my hand steady but unmoving. For a moment, I imagined signing, not in detail, just the direction everything would go afterward, conversations I wouldn't be part of, decisions explained to me after they were made. I realized then that I wasn't being asked to trust the process. I was being asked to step aside. This doesn't have to be difficult, my son said quietly. I know, that's why I'm taking a moment. The nurse shifted her weight. Would you like some water? She asked suddenly. The question cut through the room. My son turned toward her, irritation flickering across his face. She's fine. I asked her, the nurse said calmly. I looked at the nurse. Her expression wasn't alarmed. It was careful, measured. Yes, I said, I would. She nodded and stepped out of the room. The doctor frowned slightly. We really should. I need a minute, I said, setting the pen down on the desk. My voice surprised me. It was calm, firm. The room fell silent. My son stared at me, his jaw tightening. For the first time since we'd arrived, he looked uncertain, not confused, but interrupted. This is unnecessary, he said. So is rushing, I replied. No one spoke after that. The forms lay untouched between us, no longer just paperwork, but proof of how quickly control can be transferred when authority, time, and expectation align. I hadn't signed, but I understood now just how close I had come. The nurse was gone longer than it took to bring a glass of water. At first, I didn't think much of it. Offices are busy, people get pulled in different directions. But as the seconds passed, the silence in the room grew heavier, no longer neutral, now expectant. My son shifted in his chair. They really shouldn't leave patients waiting like this, he said, irritation creeping into his voice. The doctor didn't respond. He stared at the clipboard in front of him, flipping through pages that suddenly seemed far more interesting than the conversation we'd been having. When the nurse returned, she wasn't alone. Another staff member followed her in. Older, quieter, wearing the same uniform but carrying a folder instead of a tray. "Sorry for the delay," the nurse said. "We just needed to double-check something." My son straightened immediately. "There's nothing to double-check," he said. "We've already gone over the paperwork." The second nurse didn't look at him. She looked at me. "Mrs. Reynolds, can I ask you a question?" I nodded. "Did anyone explain what this document allows someone else to do right now?" she asked. The room went still. The doctor cleared his throat. "We covered the basics." "That's not what I asked," the nurse replied calmly. "I'm asking whether she understands the immediate effect." Immediate. That word sent a quiet ripple through my chest. My son laughed once, short and sharp. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." The older nurse opened the folder she was holding. "This authorization," she said, tapping the page lightly, "allows another party to make medical and financial decisions if a physician determines incapacity." My son cut in. "That's standard." The nurse nodded. "It can be, but the determination doesn't always require a court." I looked at her. "What does that mean?" She met my eyes directly. "It means," she said carefully, "that if this were signed today and a concern were documented later, decisions could be made on your behalf without your direct approval." Without my approval. The words landed quietly, but they changed everything. My son stood up. "This is getting out of hand. You're confusing her." The nurse didn't raise her voice. "I'm answering her question." The doctor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Perhaps we should slow down." Slow down. It was the first time anyone in that room had suggested that. I picked up the clipboard again and reread the paragraph I'd noticed earlier. This time, the language was clearer, not because the words had changed, but because the context had. Incapacity doesn't mean you're incapable today. It means the framework is already in place if someone decides you are. Someone. I didn't need to ask who that would be. My son's face flushed. "You're implying things that aren't true." The nurse was even. "I'm explaining what the document allows, nothing more." I turned to the doctor. "Is this accurate?" He hesitated. "It's technically correct, but these situations are handled carefully." Carefully by whom? The realization settled over me, not as panic, but as clarity. This wasn't about helping me navigate the future. It was about positioning someone else to control it. I set the clipboard down. "I won't be signing this today," I said. My son stared at me. "Mom." "No," I said, my voice steady. "I understand it now." The room felt different after that. The pressure that had been building all morning broke, replaced by something quieter but more powerful: acknowledgement. The nurses exchanged a brief glance. "We can reschedule," the older nurse said. "And if you'd like, we can review everything with legal counsel present." Legal counsel. My son sat back down slowly, his confidence draining in a way I hadn't seen before. "That won't be necessary," he said tightly. I stood. "It will be," I replied, "because once the truth is spoken aloud, it can't be folded back into paperwork." I didn't argue when we left the office. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't raise my voice or demand explanations in the hallway. I thanked the nurse, nodded politely to the doctor, and walked out the same way I had walked in, slowly, deliberately, without drawing attention to myself. My son walked beside me in silence. In the parking lot, he finally spoke. "That was unnecessary," he said. "You embarrassed me." I looked at him. "I asked a question." He scoffed. "They made it sound worse than it was." "Did they?" I asked. He didn't answer. The drive home was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet where thoughts finally have room to surface. I replayed the morning in my head, not with panic, but with distance. The language that had been used, the assumptions that had been made. the way decisions were already framed as inevitable. What struck me most wasn't what almost happened, it was how prepared everything had been. The forms, the answers already filled in. The way my son knew exactly where to point, what to say, when to rush. That didn't happen overnight. That afternoon, I made tea and sat at my kitchen table with the paperwork the nurse had copied for me. I read it slowly this time, without anyone standing over my shoulder. I didn't need to understand every clause to understand the direction of it. Control, not support. Not help, control. I didn't call my son. I didn't confront his wife. I did something else instead. The next morning, I made an appointment with an attorney, not because I wanted to start a fight, but because I needed clarity. The attorney didn't react with surprise as I explained what had happened. She listened, asked questions, and nodded in ways that told me this wasn't unfamiliar territory. This kind of situation happens more often than people realize, she said. Usually it's framed as concern. She went through the paperwork line by line, explaining what authority it would have granted and how quickly it could have taken effect. You were right to pause, she said finally. Once signed, undoing this would have been difficult. Difficult. Not impossible, but costly, exhausting, and uncertain. I asked her one question. What can I do to make sure this never happens again? She didn't hesitate. We talked about safeguards, about documentation, about making my intentions unmistakably clear. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was practical. That afternoon, I updated records I hadn't looked at in years. I reviewed beneficiaries. I clarified decision-making authority. I put boundaries in place, not out of spite, but out of necessity. For the first time in a long while, I felt calm. Not relieved, calm. When my son called that evening, I let it go to voicemail. His message was short. We need to talk. I listened to it once and didn't respond. I wasn't ready to talk. I was ready to finish protecting myself. By the end of the week, everything was in order. No signatures could be rushed. No authority could be assumed. No one could speak for me without my consent. I hadn't announced any of this. I hadn't warned anyone. Because boundaries don't require permission. They require preparation. And once they're in place, they don't need to be defended loudly. They simply exist. The conversation happened 2 days later. Not because I called him, but because he showed up. I heard his car in the driveway just after noon. I was in the kitchen rinsing a mug when the doorbell rang. I didn't rush. I finished what I was doing, dried my hands, and walked to the door at my own pace. He stood on the porch alone. No smile, no irritation this time, just a tight expression and a familiar impatience he was trying to hide. We need to talk, he said. Yes, I replied, opening the door wider. We do. He stepped inside and looked around as if he hadn't been there in years. Everything was exactly where it had always been. Nothing had changed, except me. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed. I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this, he said. That paperwork was just precautionary. I nodded. That's what you said. And it still is, he insisted. You're reading too much into it. I had it reviewed, I said calmly. He paused. Reviewed by who? An attorney. The shift in his posture was immediate. You went behind my back, he said. No, I replied. I went in front of myself. His jaw tightened. This didn't have to turn into something legal. It already was, I said. I just hadn't been told. He started pacing. You know I was just trying to help, he said. You're not as sharp as you used to be. You get tired, you forget things. I watched him carefully as he spoke, not with anger, but with attention. You decided that, I said. He stopped. I was concerned. Concern doesn't require pre-filled forms, I replied, or rushing someone to sign something they don't understand. He looked away. I was trying to protect you, he said. From what? I asked. He didn't answer. I walked to the table and picked up a folder I had prepared earlier. I placed it in front of him. What's this? He asked. Clarity, I said. Inside were copies of the updated documents. Nothing complicated, nothing dramatic, just unmistakable. My intentions, my authority, my boundaries. He flipped through the pages quickly, then more slowly. The color drained from his face. You can't do this, he said quietly. I already have. He looked up at me, something like disbelief flickering in his eyes. So that's it? You don't trust me anymore? I considered the question carefully. I trust you to want what's best for you. I no longer trust you to decide what's best for me. He scoffed. That's not fair. No, I agreed. It's accurate. He closed the folder. So what happens now? He asked. Now, I said, nothing changes except that no decisions about my life will ever be made without me again. He stood there for a long moment, silent. His wife didn't call, she didn't text, she didn't appear at my door. That told me everything I needed to know. I was just trying to be responsible, he said finally. Responsibility doesn't begin with taking control. It begins with respect. He didn't argue after that. He left shortly afterward, the same way he'd arrived, alone. I watched from the window as he drove away, the familiar shape of his car disappearing down the road. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled, because for the first time since this had begun, the imbalance had been corrected, not through confrontation, through preparation. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. There were no angry messages, no dramatic confrontations, no attempts to argue me back into compliance. After my son left that afternoon, the house settled into a stillness that felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. For the first time in a long while, no one was watching me closely. No one asked where I was going. No one reminded me of appointments. No one offered to handle things on my behalf. The silence told its own story. A week went by before I heard from him again. It wasn't a phone call. It was a short text. I hope you're okay. I read it once and set the phone down. I was okay. More than that, I was clear. What surprised me most wasn't his distance. It was how quickly my life returned to its natural rhythm once the pressure was gone. I made my own appointments again, spoke for myself, took my time with decisions instead of feeling rushed toward them. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending simply defending my competence. I saw my doctor a few weeks later, alone this time. The visit was uneventful, ordinary, exactly the way medical appointments are supposed to be when trust isn't being leveraged. Nothing was wrong with me. That confirmation didn't make me angry, it made me resolute. When family members asked why my son wasn't coming around as much, I didn't explain, I didn't justify, I didn't offer details. I simply said, we're giving each other space. And that was true. I didn't hear from his wife at all. No concern, no follow-up, no apology. Her absence spoke louder than any confrontation could have. It told me that what she valued hadn't been me. It had been access. Months passed. Seasons changed. The urgency that had defined those weeks faded into memory, replaced by something steadier. I moved through my days without the constant awareness of being observed or evaluated. I didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from my son. Short, careful, written in a tone I didn't recognize at first, measured, restrained. He apologized for how things were handled, Not for the intent, not for the preparation, but for the way it unfolded. I read the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't respond. Not because I was holding on to resentment, but because some distances need time to become honest. Trust, once altered, doesn't snap back into place just because the tension has passed. And that was something I was finally willing to accept. The aftermath didn't bring reconciliation, it brought balance. It took me a long time to understand what really happened in that doctor's office. Not because it was complicated, but because it was quiet. There was no shouting, no threats, no moment where anyone said, "I'm taking control of your life." If that had happened, I would have resisted immediately. Instead, it came disguised as concern, as help, as efficiency, as someone else deciding they knew what was best for me. I don't believe my son woke up one morning intending to erase my independence. I think it happened the way these things often do, gradually, through small assumptions that went unchallenged because challenging them felt uncomfortable. When you love someone, you want to believe their intentions are clean. You tell yourself it's easier to let things slide, easier to accept help than to insist on autonomy. But what I learned is this: when someone starts speaking for you more often than with you, something has already shifted. I didn't lose anything that day. What I almost lost was my voice. The most unsettling part wasn't how close I came to signing that paper, it was how reasonable everyone made it seem, how quickly my hesitation was framed as confusion, how easily urgency replaced explanation, and how natural it all felt until it didn't. I'm sharing this not as a warning and not as advice, but as a reminder. Pay attention to moments that feel rushed, to decisions that are presented as standard, to conversations where your questions are treated like obstacles. Those are the moments that matter most. If you're listening to this and thinking, something like this almost happened to me, trust that feeling. You don't need proof to pause. You don't need permission to ask for time. And you don't need to explain why protecting your independence matters. Before we end, I want to ask you something. If you had been sitting where I was, pen in hand, everyone waiting, time running out, what would you have done? Would you have signed to keep the peace? Or would you have stopped, even if it made the room uncomfortable? If you feel comfortable sharing, tell me in the comments. I read them all, and your stories deserve to be heard.